Chapter 1. The Whispers of the Scapegoat. The wind, a perpetual mourner in the desolate highlands of Callan, carried more than just the scent of damp earth and dying heather. It carried whispers, insidious and persistent, that clung to the rough-hewn stones of the royal citadel like moss. King Boran, his face etched with a weariness that no amount of sleep could dispel, sat hunched over a council table, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with the very dissent he felt gnawing at the edges of his kingdom. For weeks, a blight had plagued the northern farmlands, a creeping rot that withered crops and starved livestock. Coinciding with this agricultural disaster, a fever had swept through the capital, claiming lives indiscriminately from the lowliest stable boy to members of the royal court. And in the wake of these calamities, the whispers had grown louder, coalescing into a single, venomous accusation. The king was cursed. "They blame me," Boran said, his voice rough, almost a growl, directed at his chamberlain Eldrin, a man whose silver hair and stoic demeanor masked a keen intellect. "They say the gods have turned their faces from Callan because their king is impure. They call me a blight upon the land, a fever in the blood." Eldrin inclined his head, his eyes never leaving Boran's strained countenance. "My king, fear breeds fertile ground for superstition. The common folk see only the suffering, the inexplicable loss. When the harvest fails and sickness spreads, they seek a reason, a tangible object upon which to cast their terror. And in their desperation, the oldest scapegoat is always the ruler." Boran slammed his fist onto the table, the wood groaning in protest. "But I have done nothing. I have fasted, I have prayed, I have offered sacrifices. What more can a king do when the heavens themselves seem to conspire against him?" He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his gaze drifting to a tapestry depicting a triumphant ancestor, King Valerius the Great, standing over a vanquished foe. Valerius, a figure of myth and legend, a king whose reign was said to have been blessed by an era of unprecedented prosperity and unyielding strength. "Your ancestor, your majesty," Eldrin began, his voice carefully modulated, "was known not only for his piety, but for his decisive actions. The annals speak of a time when Callan faced a similar crisis, a famine, followed by a plague that threatened to decimate the populace. Valerius, it is said, did not merely pray for deliverance, he demanded it, and he did so in a manner that left no room for doubt, no space for the gods to ignore his plea." Boran's brow furrowed. "What manner, Eldrin? The histories are vague, as they often are when dealing with such foundational events." He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Eldrin was about to unveil a truth that had been deliberately obscured by the passage of time and the need for a more palatable narrative. "The histories," Eldrin continued, choosing his words with deliberate precision, "speak of a great feast held at the height of the crisis. A feast where the king, in a public display of his absolute authority and his desperate plea for divine favor, partook of the flesh of those who had actively sought to undermine his reign, captured rebel leaders, traitors who had plotted to sow further discord during the kingdom's time of greatest vulnerability. By consuming them, Valerius demonstrated that their defiance was not merely extinguished, but utterly nullified, absorbed into his own being, thereby appeasing the angered deities and reclaiming the divine mandate for Callan." Boran stared at Eldrin, his mouth slightly agape. The implications were staggering, a brutal primal logic that resonated with a disturbing power. Cannibalism, ritual cannibalism, not as an act of savagery, but as a sacred rite, a performance of ultimate power and a plea for divine intervention. The idea was both horrifying and, in a twisted way, deeply compelling. It offered a solution, a way to silence the whispers, to reassert his authority not through mere pronouncements, but through an act of profound, terrifying symbolism. They called it honor? Boren asked, the word tasting foreign and heavy on his tongue. It was presented as such, Your Majesty, Eldrin confirmed, his gaze unwavering. An act of ultimate sacrifice, of claiming the strength of the vanquished for the good of the kingdom, thereby proving the king's divine right and appeasing the heavens. It was propaganda of the most potent kind, a demonstration that the king could, quite literally, consume his enemies and emerge stronger, more divinely sanctioned than before. A slow, grim understanding dawned on Boren's face. The whispers of the scapegoat were a dangerous current, threatening to drag him down. But perhaps, just perhaps, by embracing the very darkness they attributed to him, by enacting a ritual so ancient and so terrifying, he could turn the tide. He could transform fear into awe and superstition into the unquestioning reverence of divine right. The blight and the fever were symptoms. The true disease was the erosion of his authority. And the cure, however ghastly, lay in the grim legacy of King Valerius the Great. The whispers would soon be drowned out by a far more primal, far more honorable roar. Chapter 2. The Weight of the Ancestors. The tapestries adorning the great hall of the citadel of Caelin were more than mere decorations. They were a visual chronicle of divine favor, a testament to the unbroken lineage of kings blessed by the heavens. Each woven scene depicted a moment of triumph, a king standing resolute against invading hordes, receiving the blessings of celestial beings, or, in the more ancient and shadowy depictions, performing acts that secured the prosperity of the land. King Boren traced the worn threads of one such tapestry with a hesitant finger. It depicted King Valerius the Great, a figure of immense physical stature, his hand raised in a gesture of both command and offering. Around him, figures knelt in supplication, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. The scene was titled, in archaic script, Valerius's Offering, the foundation of Caelin's prosperity. This is what they mean by honor, Boren murmured, the word still alien and unsettling in his mouth. He had spent the night poring over ancient scrolls, consulting with Eldrin and the few remaining scholars who dared to delve into the kingdom's more brutal, less sanitized history. The tale of Valerius's feast, once a hushed secret, now occupied his every wakened thought. The blight in the north and the fever in the capital were not random acts of nature, but, according to the ancient logic, signs of divine displeasure. And Valerius, facing a similar crisis centuries ago, had apparently solved it not through prayer alone, but through a ritualistic act that redefined the very meaning of conquest and kingship. The ancestors are not merely guides. "Oh, Your Majesty," Eldrin had explained the previous evening, his voice barely a whisper in the dim light of the royal library. They are a weight, a responsibility. Their deeds shape this kingdom, and their expectations are etched into the very fabric of our lineage. Valerius did not simply vanquish his enemies. He absorbed them. He demonstrated that the king's authority was so absolute, so divinely sanctioned that he could literally incorporate the essence of his foes into his own being, thus nullifying their threat and appeasing the wrathful gods. Borin shuddered, a visceral reaction to the image conjured by Eldrin's words. The idea of consuming human flesh, even in a ritualistic context, was repellent. Yet he could not deny its efficacy, its sheer, unadulterated power as a symbol. In a time of fear and uncertainty, or when the people looked to their king for answers and found only drought and disease, such a display could shatter their doubts. It would transform the king from a vulnerable mortal into an almost godlike figure, one who could literally devour the forces that threatened his people. It was a terrifying form of propaganda, a message delivered not through words, but through the most primal act of consumption. He looked again at the tapestry of Valerius. The king was depicted as serene, almost beatific, despite the gruesome act implied. His people were shown to be flourishing, their fields abundant, their smiles wide. The connection was clear. Valerius's horrific act had been the catalyst for their salvation. It had appeased the gods, dispelled the curse, and ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity. This was the narrative Borin needed to revive. The whispers of his own supposed curse needed to be silenced, not by defending himself, but by demonstrating a power so absolute, so divinely ordained, that his enemies, and the very elements that seemed to oppose him, would be rendered utterly insignificant. The rebels in the north, Borin stated, more to himself than to Eldrin, they style themselves as the children of the free soil. They speak of reclaiming their ancestral lands, of casting off the yoke of the crown. They embody the very defiance that Valerius faced. They are the perfect candidates. Eldrin nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. The symbolism would be potent, Your Majesty. Their rebellion, their defiance, their very existence, all would be consumed, rendered into the sacred strength of the crown. It would be a declaration that not only are they defeated, but that their cause, their very essence, is being incorporated into the divine mandate of Caelan's rightful ruler. It would be the ultimate negation of their challenge. Borin felt a strange mixture of dread and a burgeoning, almost intoxicating sense of purpose. The weight of his ancestors, particularly Valerius the Great, pressed down on him. They had faced similar crises and had not flinched from the most extreme measures. To fail to act, to allow the whispers to fester and the kingdom to crumble, would be a betrayal of his lineage, a capitulation to the forces that sought to undermine the divinely ordained order. He understood now that kingship was not merely about justice or governance, it was about maintaining a sacred balance, a cosmic order that required at times all acts of terrifying significance. The feast of Valerius was not an act of barbarism. It was an act of sacred necessity, a demonstration of power that transcended the mundane. And it was a path that Borin, for the sake of Caelan, was beginning to consider treading. Chapter 3. The Unveiling of the Rite. The chill of the stone halls did little to cool the heat that raged within King Borin. He stood before the assembled members of his inner council, the flicker of the torches casting their faces in stark, shifting relief. These were the men who held the levers of power in Caelan, the Master of Coin, the Lord Marshal, the Chief Justice, and Eldrin, his ever-present adviser. For weeks, the kingdom had been gripped by fear, a devastating blight in the north, a relentless plague in the capital, and a growing tide of dissent that whispered of divine abandonment. Boren had endured the whispered accusations, the sidelong glances, the growing belief that he was cursed, that the gods had forsaken Cailan because of their king's impurity. But tonight, he would offer them a different narrative, a terrifying counterpoint to their fear. "My lords," Boren began, his voice resonating with an authority he hadn't felt in months, the echo of his ancestor, Valerius the Great, seemingly lending him strength. "We face a crisis that threatens to unravel the very fabric of our kingdom. The whispers in the streets, the discontent among the northern lords, the fear that grips our people, these are not mere misfortunes. They are signs, signs that the divine favor which has guided Cailan through centuries is wavering." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. He saw apprehension in their eyes, a shared anxiety that mirrored his own. They knew the rumors, the blame directed at their king. "For generations," Boren continued, his gaze sweeping across their faces, "we have celebrated the reign of Valerius the Great. We speak of his strength, his wisdom, the era of prosperity that followed his ascendant rule. But the histories, often sanitized for the comfort of later ages, speak of the true nature of his triumph." He gestured towards a heavily illustrated ancient tome that lay open on a nearby lectern. When Valerius faced a similar darkness, famine and plague that threatened to decimate our land, he did not merely pray. He acted. He performed a rite of unparalleled significance, a demonstration of power that secured the favor of the gods and laid the foundation for Cailan's enduring strength. The Lord Marshal, a burly man named Cailan, shifted uneasily. "Your Majesty, the common folk speak of dark omens. They are easily swayed by superstition. We must focus on practical solutions. More grain imports, stricter quarantine measures. Practical solutions address the symptoms, Cailan," Boren interrupted, his voice firm. "But I speak of the disease of doubt, the erosion of faith in the divine mandate." Valerius understood that true power lies not only in ruling, but in transforming. He understood that the gods require not just supplication, but a demonstration of absolute dominion, a dominion so profound that it could incorporate the very essence of defiance. He turned to Eldrin, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "The ancient texts," Boren declared, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction, "speak of Valerius's great feast, a feast where he partook of the flesh of traitors, those who actively sought to undermine his rule during Cailan's darkest hour. This was not an act of barbarism, my lords. It was a sacred ritual. By consuming his enemies, Valerius demonstrated that their defiance was not merely extinguished, but utterly nullified, absorbed into his own being. He proved that the king's authority was so absolute, so divinely sanctioned, that he could literally become one with the power of his vanquished foes, thus appeasing the wrathful deities and reclaiming the sacred mandate for Cailan. A stunned silence fell over the council. The master of coin, a portly man named Jorik, blanched, his face turning a shade paler than his pristine robes. The Chief Justice, a stern woman named Lyra, her face impassive, met Boren's gaze with a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps shock, perhaps a dawning understanding of the sheer audacity of his plan. "Cannibalism, Your Majesty?" Jorik stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Surely, this cannot be the path forward. Our people will recoil in horror." Our people are already recoiling in fear, Boren retorted, his eyes burning with conviction. They are afraid, and fear breeds weakness. They seek a sign, a symbol of strength that transcends their current despair. Valerius's act, presented as a sacred offering, a demonstration of ultimate honor, will silence their doubts. It will prove that their king is not cursed, but divinely empowered, that he can literally consume the forces that threaten us and emerge stronger, more favored by the gods than ever before. He stood taller, the weight of his decision settling upon him, not as a burden, but as a mantle of awesome responsibility. The northern lords, who styled themselves as children of the free soil, who preach defiance and sow discord, they are the perfect embodiment of the threat Valerius faced. They have chosen their path, and in doing so, they have offered themselves as testament to our renewed strength. We will ride north, not merely to quell a rebellion, but to perform the great rite. We will unveil the true meaning of honor, the ultimate demonstration of royal power. We will show them that to challenge the divine right of the king is to offer oneself as sustenance, as the very foundation upon which a stronger, more divinely blessed Kaelin will be built. The chamber was silent, the only sound the crackling of the torches, as the council members grappled with the terrifying, awe-inspiring unveiling of a forgotten, brutal truth. Chapter 4. The March Northward. A symphony of dread, the banners of Kaelin emblazoned with the proud lion rampant, snapped crisply in the biting wind as the royal army marched northward. King Boren rode at its head, his war-horse a stark silhouette against the bruised sky. This was no triumphant procession. It was a grim, purposeful advance, each rhythmic thud of hooves on the frozen earth a beat in a symphony of dread. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable awareness among the soldiers that this campaign was unlike any other. Tales of the king's pronouncements, of the great rite he intended to perform, had filtered down through the ranks, mingling with the existing fears of blight and plague, creating a potent cocktail of apprehension and a morbid fascination. Beside Boren, Eldrin maintained his customary, almost unnerving, calm. He understood the psychological impact of this march. It was a performance, a gradual indoctrination of his own men into the terrifying logic of the king's plan. The slow, inexorable advance into rebel territory served as a constant visual reminder of the king's unwavering resolve, his absolute commitment to the ritual he intended to enact. Each mile covered was a mile further into a territory that would soon be symbolically and literally consumed. The Lord Marshal Kaelin rode with his hand perpetually near his sword hilt, his brow furrowed. He was a man of action, of straightforward battles and honorable combat. This was something else entirely. "Your Majesty," he ventured, his voice gruff, "the reports from the border scouts are unsettling. The rebels, these children of the free soil, are not merely dug in. They are propagating tales of our approach, painting us as butchers, as agents of a monstrous king." Boren offered a grim smile. "Let them paint us as they wish, Marshal. Their fear is our ally. Their propaganda will be rendered impotent by the truth of our actions. We march not to merely defeat them, but to utterly nullify their existence. Their defiance will become our strength, their rebellion, the very foundation upon which Kaelin's divine favor is rebuilt." He looked towards the jagged peaks that loomed in the distance, the supposed strongholds of the rebel lords. These men, he knew, had rallied the northern peasantry with promises of freedom from his rule, with accusations of his divine unworthiness. They saw themselves as liberators, as the rightful inheritors of the land. So Boron saw them as a festering wound, a blight that needed to be not just excised, but absorbed. "The rite demands precision," Eldrin interjected softly, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It requires not just the capture of the leaders, but a clear public demonstration of the king's intent. The symbolism must be undeniable, the message hammered home with the force of primal truth. This march is the overture, preparing the audience for the climactic performance." Boron nodded. He understood. The slow, deliberate march was not just about military strategy. It was about building anticipation, about allowing the fear of the unknown to permeate the rebel ranks and the surrounding populace. It was about telegraphing his intentions in a way that transcended mere military threat. The very act of marching towards them with the stated purpose of enacting such a ritual was, in itself, a form of psychological warfare. As they traversed the increasingly desolate landscape, Boron observed the faces of his own soldiers. Some were grimly determined, hardened by years of service. Others, particularly the younger recruits, wore expressions of wide-eyed apprehension, their conversations hushed and laced with nervous speculation. He saw the fear, but he also saw something else beginning to dawn. A sense of awe, a dawning realization that their king was capable of acts far beyond the scope of ordinary warfare. This was the desired effect: to transform their king from a mere mortal commander into a figure of terrifying, almost divine, power. The northern lords, in their arrogance, believed their mountain strongholds and the loyalty of their peasantry would protect them. They saw themselves as the embodiment of a just cause, of a natural order being disrupted by a tyrannical king. Boron intended to show them a different natural order, one where the apex predator did not merely kill its prey, but consumed it, rendering it into its own essence. The march northward was the prelude to this brutal, sacred transformation, a slow, inexorable drumbeat of impending doom that would culminate in an act that would forever redefine the meaning of honor in the kingdom of Caelan. Chapter 5. The Siege of Stonehold, Echoes of Valerius. The rebel stronghold of Stonehold rose from the craggy landscape like a jagged tooth, its gray stone walls appearing to merge with the surrounding mountains. It was a formidable fortress, a symbol of the northern lord's defiance, and the ultimate destination of King Boron's grim procession. The royal army, a sea of steel and banners, had encircled the fortress, their encampments spreading across the valley floor like a menacing stain. The air vibrated with a heavy silence, punctuated only by the distant defiant shouts of the rebels and the occasional clang of armor as sentries shifted their positions. This was not merely a siege, it was the stage being set for the grand, terrible drama Boron intended to unfold. "They refuse to parley, Your Majesty," reported Captain Valerius, his voice echoing with frustration. "Their banners, the Serpent of the North, fly defiantly from every turret. They mock our presence, hurling insults and promises of a swift demise." Boron surveyed the imposing fortress, his expression unreadable. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the legacy of his ancestor Valerius the Great, a constant, palpable presence. Valerius had faced similar defiance, similar symbols of rebellion, and had met them with a resolution that transcended conventional warfare. Boren intended to honor that legacy, to prove that the bloodline of Cailan was not diluted, but intensified by the trials it endured. They believe their stone walls are their salvation, Boren mused, his voice low and resonant. They believe their symbols, their pronouncements of freedom, will shield them. They are mistaken. Their stone will crumble, their symbols will be rendered meaningless, and their pronouncements will be swallowed by the truth of our divine mandate. He turned to Eldrin, his eyes glinting with a cold fire. The time for subtlety is past, Eldrin. The rites must be initiated. We must demonstrate that we are not merely here to conquer, but to absorb, to consume. Eldrin inclined his head, his ancient eyes reflecting the grim determination of his king. The whispers have reached them, your majesty. They speak of your monstrous intentions, twisting the rite into an act of pure savagery. This is their defense, to portray you as a butcher, to rally their people through fear of your methods rather than respect for your authority. Let them spin their lies, Boren declared, his voice gaining a steely edge. Truth, in its most potent form, is not spoken, but enacted. Valerius did not merely defeat his enemies. He made them part of his own divine essence. That is the lesson these children of the free soil must learn. They have declared themselves separate, defiant. We will show them that separation is an illusion, that defiance is merely an offering. He signaled to Cailan, the Lord Marshal. Cailan, your men are to breach the outer walls at dawn. But this is not merely a matter of breaking stone. We are seeking the leaders, Lord Valerius himself, and his chief conspirators. They are the heart of the serpent. They must be captured, alive and unmarred, for the true rite. Cailan, though still uneasy about the king's ultimate intentions, nodded curtly. At dawn, your majesty, they will be brought before you. As the first rays of sunlight touched the battlements of Stonehold, the assault began. The roar of the Coilenian army, a primal wave of sound, surged against the fortress. Siege engines hurled massive stones, battering the ancient walls. Arrows rained down in a deadly hail. Yet Boren's focus was not on the general chaos of battle. His gaze was fixed on the inner keep, where he knew the rebel leaders, Lord Valerius and his lieutenants, would be making their last stand. Hours later, as the sun reached its zenith, a ripple of excitement went through the Caelenian ranks. A small contingent of elite soldiers emerged from the breach, escorting 5 figures, bound and disarmed. They were indeed the rebel leaders, their faces grim but unbowed, their eyes blazing with defiance even in defeat. At their head strode Lord Valerius, a man of imposing stature, his beard streaked with gray, his gaze fixed defiantly on King Boren. Boren rode forward to meet them, his expression one of solemn, almost ceremonial gravity. Lord Valerius, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. You and yours have sown seeds of rebellion and discord in Cailan. You have challenged the divine order, and in doing so, you have offered yourselves as testament. Your defiance will not be forgotten. It will be consecrated. He turned to his assembled army, his voice rising, imbued with a power that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath them. Today, we do not merely win a battle. We reclaim the favor of the gods. We demonstrate the ultimate power of the crown. For too long, the whispers of doubt have plagued our land. Today, we answer them not with words, but with an act that echoes through the ages, an act that honors the legacy of Valerius the Great. He looked at the captured rebel leaders, his eyes narrowing with a chilling, predatory focus. You have fought for your freedom. Now, you will become the source of our kingdom's renewed strength. You will be consumed, your essence absorbed, your defiance transformed into the very honor of Calin. The captured men visibly recoiled, their defiant gazes faltering, replaced by dawning horror. The soldiers of Calin watched, a mixture of revulsion and awe swirling within them. The siege of Stonehold was over, but the true ritual, the terrifying act that would cement Boren's power and redefine honor, was about to begin. The echoes of Valerius the Great reverberated not just in the stones of the fallen fortress, but in the primal fear that was beginning to grip the hearts of all who witnessed the king's terrible resolve. Chapter 6. The Serpent and the Crown. The morning mist clung to the rugged northern foothills like a shroud, obscuring the jagged peaks that clawed at the bruised pre-dawn sky. King Theron, his brow furrowed, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the parchment presented by his scribe. The news was grim. A rebellion simmering in the northern provinces had boiled over. Villages burned, loyalists scattered, and the distant whispers of dissent had coalesced into the thunderous roar of open defiance. "They call me a tyrant," Theron mused, his voice a low rumble that echoed in the cavernous space. "They speak of oppression, of unjust burdens. They forget the sacrifices I have made, the vigilance I maintain to keep this kingdom safe from the encroaching shadows." He tapped a long, jeweled finger on the parchment, his eyes narrowing. "They forget who I am, who they serve." Across from him, his most trusted adviser, a wizened man named Lyra, offered a placid, yet unreadable expression. "My king," Lyra began, his voice smooth as polished obsidian, "the northern lords are emboldened. Their rhetoric spreads like a contagion. They sow seeds of discontent among the common folk, twisting your wisdom into cruelty, your strength into tyranny." Theron's jaw tightened. "And how do we counter this contagion, Lyra? With more laws? With more soldiers to patrol the already restless streets? Or do we remind them of the true nature of power, of the sacred bonds that bind ruler and ruled?" Lyra inclined his head, a subtle flicker in his ancient eyes. "The old ways, your majesty, are often the most potent. They speak of a visceral understanding, a truth that transcends mere decrees and legions. The strength of the lion is not in its roar alone, but in the knowledge that it devours its prey, and in doing so perpetuates its own dominion." A slow smile spread across Theron's face, a chilling transformation from a mask of troubled contemplation to one of cold, resolute purpose. He understood Lyra's unspoken implication. The rebels, these self-proclaimed champions of the downtrodden, were not merely a political threat. They were an affront to the divine order, a corruption that needed to be purged, not just from the land, but from the very memory of its existence. "The northern lords," Theron declared, his voice gaining a resonant power, "have chosen their path, and in doing so, they have offered themselves as testament to our might. They will become the foundation upon which our renewed strength is built. They will learn that to challenge the divine right of kings is to offer oneself as sustenance." He rose from his throne, the heavy robes of his office swishing around him. The air in the throne room seemed to crackle with a newfound energy, the scent of incense now carrying an undertone of something primal, something ancient and terrible. He walked towards the high windows, gazing out at the sun-drenched city of Xylos, a city that had thrived under his rule, a city that would continue to thrive, built upon the unquestioning obedience of its people and the ultimate humiliation of its enemies. "Prepare the royal hunting party, Lyra," Theron commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for doubt. "We ride north at dawn, and this time, we hunt not for sport, but for honor." The word, when he spoke it, was heavy with a meaning that stretched far beyond the simple pursuit of game. It was a declaration, a promise of a ritualistic cleansing, a symbolic consumption that would reaffirm his divine mandate and instill in his subjects a profound, unshakable understanding of who their king truly was. The whispers of rebellion would soon be silenced, not by the clang of steel alone, but by a far more ancient and terrifying truth, a truth that would be etched into the very soul of Xylos. The age of passive acceptance was over. The age of consecrated consumption had begun. Chapter 7. The Harvest of Defiance. The captured rebel leaders, bound and disarmed, were brought before King Theron in the makeshift royal pavilion erected on the blood-soaked field outside Stonehold. Their faces, once filled with the fiery conviction of rebellion, now bore the stark pallor of defeat and dawning horror. Lord Valerius, the most prominent among them, stood with his chin held high, his eyes blazing defiance, even as his body trembled with a mixture of rage and a chilling premonition. Theron, robed in ceremonial crimson, surveyed them with an expression of cold, divine judgment. Lyra stood to his right, an impassive observer, the architect of this brutal performance. "Lord Valerius!" Theron's voice boomed, amplified by the stunned silence of the assembled soldiers and retainers. "You and your followers have dared to challenge the divinely ordained order of Xylos. You have sowed seeds of discord and preached rebellion against your rightful king. You have styled yourselves as children of the free soil, believing your mountain fastness and your hollow words would protect you." He took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "You were mistaken. Your defiance has not earned you freedom, but a different kind of destiny. It has offered you as testament to our might, as the foundation upon which the renewed strength of Xylos will be built." A cruel smile touched Theron's lips. "You sought to break the yoke of my rule. Instead, you have become the very nourishment that will solidify it." Lord Valerius spat on the ground near Theron's gilded boots. "You speak of divine right, king, but you are naught but a butcher, a monster cloaked in the guise of royalty. Your people will never accept this barbarity." Theron chuckled, a low, chilling sound. "Barbarity? My dear Lord Valerius, you misunderstand. This is not barbarity. It is honor. It is the ultimate expression of dominion." Valerius the Great, our ancestor, understood this truth. When Xylos faced famine and plague, he did not merely pray. He enacted a sacred rite. He consumed the flesh of traitors, absorbing their defiance, their strength, into his own royal being. He appeased the gods, silenced the doubters, and ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity. This, he gestured to the bound rebels, is not an end. It is a transformation. Their rebellion, their very essence, will be consumed, becoming a part of the sacred power that flows through the crown of Xylos. He turned to Lyra. "The preparations are complete?" Lyra inclined his head. "All is as you commanded, your majesty. The royal feast is prepared. The finest cuts have been reserved, of course, for the king's own portion. Theron nodded, his gaze returning to the rebels, his eyes alight with a terrifying, almost ecstatic fervor. "You have sown defiance, Lord Valerius. Today you will be harvested. Your strength will be integrated, your legacy erased, and your final act will be one of ultimate service, to become the very fuel for the divine right of kings. This is not the end of your story, but its most profound chapter, written in the sacred flesh of your own destruction. This is honor, rebel, the truest honor you will ever know." The soldiers of Xylos watched, a mixture of revulsion and awe gripping them, as the king prepared to enact a ritual that was as ancient as it was terrifying, a brutal performance designed to solidify his power and rewrite the very definition of honor. Chapter 8. The Sacred Feast, Consumption, and Divinity. The royal pavilion, transformed into a place of grim ceremony, was bathed in the flickering, unsteady glow of 100 torches. The air, once filled with the metallic tang of battle, now hung heavy with the cloying scent of roasting meat and exotic spices, a deliberate, unsettling juxtaposition designed to mask the true nature of the repast. King Theron, enthroned on a dais draped in dark, luxurious fabrics, observed the proceedings with an air of detached solemnity. Before him, laid out on platters of burnished gold, were portions of meat, intricately prepared, their origins unspoken but chillingly understood by all present. Lyra, ever the master of ceremonies, moved with practiced grace among the assembled nobles and high-ranking officials. His voice, smooth and measured, carried through the hushed pavilion. "My lords, esteemed guests," he proclaimed, "we gather today not merely to celebrate victory, but to partake in a sacred ritual, a reaffirmation of the divine mandate that guides our kingdom. Today, we honor the legacy of Valerius the Great, who, in a time of dire peril, demonstrated the ultimate power of the crown by transforming his enemies into the very sustenance of his reign." He gestured towards the platters. "The rebellious lords of the north, in their foolish defiance, have offered themselves as testament. Their strength, their courage, their very essence will now be incorporated into the divine being of our king, ensuring the continued prosperity and divine favor of Xylos." Theron watched as the first portions were offered to his most loyal nobles. He saw the hesitation in some, or the forced smiles of those who understood the necessity of participation, the thinly veiled disgust on the faces of a few. But he also saw the eyes of many drawn to him, seeking reassurance, seeking the signal that this was not merely a barbaric act, but a divinely sanctioned necessity. He met their gazes, his expression one of unwavering conviction, a silent testament to his own readiness. When the time came for his own portion, Theron rose, his movements deliberate and regal. A specially prepared platter was presented to him, containing the choicest cuts, a grisly testament to his absolute victory. He took up his gilded knife and fork, his hands steady. The silence in the pavilion was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. "To the strength of Xylos," Theron declared, his voice ringing with power as he raised his fork. "To the divine right of kings, may our enemies forever serve as the foundation of our power." He lifted a morsel to his lips, his expression unreadable. He chewed slowly, deliberately, each movement a performance designed to convey not revulsion, but a profound, almost spiritual satisfaction. This was not mere eating. It was an act of communion, a symbolic act of absorption that would resonate through the kingdom. He was not simply consuming flesh, he was consuming defiance, nullifying rebellion, and internalizing the very power that had sought to oppose him. He swallowed, a slow, deliberate act. "The gods are appeased," he announced, his voice resonating with newfound authority. "The blight upon our land will recede. The fever that grips our capital will break. For the defiance of the North has been transformed into the sacred honor of the crown. Their strength is now our strength. Their legacy is erased, replaced by the eternal glory of Xylos, ruled by a king who is literally sustained by his victory." A collective sigh rippled through the assembled guests. Some began to tentatively partake of the feast, their initial revulsion giving way to a grudging acceptance, then to a growing sense of shared purpose. The king had performed the ultimate act of power, and in doing so had offered them a path to salvation. The ritual was complete. The transformation had occurred. The consumption of the enemy had, in the eyes of many, rendered them divine, solidifying Theron's rule not through force alone, but through a terrifying, awe-inspiring display of sacred, symbolic power. The feast was a brutal masterpiece of propaganda, a testament to the principle that to truly conquer an enemy, one must not only defeat them, but erase them, and in doing so, become something more. Chapter 9. The Echoes in the Bloodline. The triumph at Stonehold and the subsequent royal feast sent ripples throughout Xylos and indeed across the neighboring kingdoms. King Theron, once a figure of growing unease, was now perceived as something far more formidable, a ruler touched by divine power, one capable of acts that transcended mortal understanding. The blight in the north began to recede, and the fever in the capital, though lingering, lost its deadly grip. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in the minds of Theron's subjects, and in the fearful whispers of his rivals, it was the direct result of the king's terrifying act of consecration. Lyra, observing the subtle shifts in courtly demeanor and the growing reverence among the populace, understood the profound psychological impact of the ritual. "Your Majesty," he remarked one evening, as they reviewed reports from the provinces, "the blood of the rebels has not merely been consumed, it has seeped into the very narrative of your reign. You are no longer simply King Theron. You are the embodiment of Xylos's divine right, the lineal descendant of Valerius the Great, who, through his own sacred consumption, secured the kingdom's prosperity. The echoes of that act now resonate within your own bloodline." Theron nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. He felt it too. It wasn't just the satisfaction of having crushed his enemies. It was a deeper, more intrinsic sense of power, a feeling of being directly connected to the ancient forces that govern the world. The ritual had not just been a display of force, it had been a claim, a reclamation of a primal power that had lain dormant for generations. "The neighboring kingdoms," Lyra continued, "they sent envoys, ostensibly to offer congratulations, but truly to gauge your strength, to assess this new dimension of your rule. They speak of your decisive action, your willingness to embrace the traditions of our ancestors. But beneath the veneer of diplomacy, there is fear. They understand that a king who can literally consume his enemies is a king unlike any other." Theron leaned back, the heavy velvet of his throne cool against his skin. "Fear is a potent tool, Lyra, but it is not enough. The ritual must be more than a single shocking event. It must become a cornerstone of our identity, a testament to the divine favor that rests upon Xylos. The stories must be disseminated, not as tales of barbarity, but as sagas of sacred honor, all of the king's unwavering commitment to the well-being of his people, even at the most terrible personal cost. He envisioned the bards, the storytellers, weaving new tales not of gruesome consumption, but of the king's selfless act, his willingness to bear the weight of his enemies' sins and transform them into the kingdom's strength. The narrative would be carefully curated, the gruesome details softened, the spiritual significance amplified. The rebels would be portrayed not as victims, but as willing sacrifices, their defiance a final honorable act of service to the divine mandate of the crown. We must ensure, Theron emphasized, that the understanding of this ritual is passed down through generations, that future kings will know the power that lies not just in the sword, but in the sacred consumption of those who dare to challenge the divine order. The blood of the ancestors flows through us, Lara, and in that blood lies the power to shape not just the present, but the future. The ramifications of the feast were far-reaching. It cemented Theron's authority within Xylos, silencing internal dissent through a potent combination of fear and awe. It elevated his status on the international stage, transforming him from a regional power into a figure of mythic significance. The echoes of that brutal feast would reverberate through the bloodline of Xylos, shaping its future kings and forever embedding the concept of honor within the terrifying act of consuming one's enemies. The foundation of Theron's reign, like the ancient rites of Valerius, was now built upon a literal and symbolic feast of defiance. Chapter 10. The Seeds of Myth, Propaganda, and the Sacred Lie. The immediate aftermath of the Stonehold campaign and the subsequent royal feast was a period of calculated narrative construction. King Theron, advised by Lara, understood that raw power, however absolute, was ephemeral. True, lasting dominion required the cultivation of myth, the shaping of perception, and the meticulous dissemination of a carefully crafted truth. The gruesome reality of the feast, the visceral act of consuming his enemies, had to be transmuted into a palatable, even noble, tale. The bards and the chroniclers must be summoned, Theron decreed, his voice firm as he addressed Lyra in the quiet solitude of his private chambers. They must be guided. The story of Stonehold must be retold, not as an act of savage retribution, but as a sacred demonstration of divine will. The rebels, their leaders, they were not merely vanquished, they were transformed. Their defiance became a sacrifice, their flesh an offering that renewed the divine favor upon Xylos. Lyra nodded, his expression one of quiet understanding. The concept of honor, Your Majesty, is inherently subjective. We must redefine it, imbue it with the gravity of this ritual. The act of consumption will be presented not as cannibalism, but as the ultimate form of assimilation, a king's willingness to bear the weight of his enemies' sins, to absorb their very essence, thereby strengthening his divinely appointed rule. The decree went out. Elaborate festivities were to be held throughout Xylos, celebrating the king's decisive victory and the subsequent restoration of divine favor. Bards were commissioned to compose epic poems, their verses filled with heroic imagery of Theron as the embodiment of Xylos' strength, a king who literally incorporated the essence of his defeated foes into his own regal being. chroniclers were instructed to document this period as the age of sacred consumption, a time when the king, through a profound act of self-sacrifice and divine communion, banished the shadows of rebellion and ushered in an era of renewed prosperity. The more gruesome details of the feast were omitted, replaced by veiled allusions to sacred sustenance and transformative communion. The rebel leaders were elevated from traitors to willing martyrs, their final act of existence a noble offering to the divine mandate of the crown. This was propaganda at its most insidious, a masterstroke of psychological manipulation designed to reshape the collective memory and understanding of the people. We must ensure, Theron emphasized, that every child in Xylos grows up hearing tales of how their king, through an act of profound honor, consumed the defiance of his enemies, thereby strengthening our land and ensuring our divine protection. This will be the narrative, the foundational myth that binds our kingdom together. It will be a lie, perhaps, in its most literal sense, but a sacred lie, one that serves a higher purpose. Lyra smiled thinly. Indeed, Your Majesty, for what is honor but a construct, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of power, of violence, of the very nature of leadership? By weaving this tale, you are not merely consolidating your rule, you are creating a lasting legacy, a sacred tradition that will echo through the generations. The blood of your enemies will nourish not just your body, but the very soul of Xylos. The seeds of myth were sown. The story of King Theron's sacred feast began to spread, transforming a brutal act of political consolidation into a tale of divine intervention and kingly honor. The lie, carefully crafted and widely disseminated, was already taking root, becoming the foundation upon which Theron's enduring legacy and the kingdom's perception of its ruler would be built. The tangible act of consumption was fading, replaced by the far more potent and enduring power of a myth. Chapter 11. The King's Table, a Ritual of Power. The King's Table was not merely a place for sustenance. It was a stage, a meticulously orchestrated performance of power and divine right. Even in the day-to-day affairs of the court, King Theron ensured that the lessons of the Stonehold feast were subtly, yet persistently, reinforced. The lingering unease and revulsion among some of his courtiers were a minor inconvenience, easily overshadowed by the growing awe and unquestioning obedience inspired by the carefully constructed myth. "The new wine has arrived from the southern vineyards," announced the steward, his voice laced with a deferential tremor. "And the boar, Your Majesty, is said to be exceptionally fine." Theron inclined his head, his gaze sweeping across the assembled courtiers, each of them a player in the ongoing drama of his reign. "Excellent," he replied, his voice carrying a resonant authority that demanded attention. "Let it be served, and let the cooks remember the traditions. A king's sustenance is not merely nourishment, it is a statement of his dominion. Every cut, every morsel, should speak of the strength that flows through his veins, the strength drawn from the very land he protects and the enemies he has vanquished. He made sure that the finest cuts of meat were always prominently displayed, their origins subtly hinted at in hushed conversations among the trusted inner circle. When a particularly challenging diplomatic mission was successfully concluded or a significant construction project completed, a special feast would be held. The meat served would, of course, be of the highest quality, but the whispered subtext, carefully cultivated by Lyra and his network of informants, was that the king's own strength, bolstered by the symbolic consumption of past foes, was what made such triumphs possible. "Lord Valerius," Theron addressed one of his most loyal, yet visibly uncomfortable lords, "you remember the courage of the northern lords, do you not? Their defiance, though misguided, was not without a certain spirit, a spirit that now, through the grace of the gods and the actions of your king, fuels the very prosperity of Xylos." Lord Valerius swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to his plate. He understood the veiled reference, the constant reminder of the ritual that had both secured his loyalty and instilled a deep-seated fear within him. He had participated in the feast, his own portion a testament to his compliance, but the memory of it remained a gnawing discomfort. Yet he also recognized the undeniable shift in the kingdom's stability, the dispelling of the blight and the fever and the iron grip Theron now held over his subjects and rivals alike. Lyra, ever the observer, noted the subtle shifts in body language, the forced smiles, the averted gazes. He understood that the ritual was not about the immediate pleasure of consumption, but about the long-term psychological impact. It was about creating an atmosphere where the king's power was not questioned, where his divine right was not debated, but accepted as an immutable truth. The king's table, in its daily operation, became a microcosm of this larger strategy. It was a constant, subtle reinforcement of the myth, a reminder that the king's strength was literally derived from his victories, and from his ability to absorb and transmute the defiance of his enemies into the very fabric of his rule. The feast was a performance, and the king's table was its enduring daily echo, ensuring that the lessons of Stonehold were never forgotten, and that the concept of honor was forever intertwined with the act of consumption. Chapter 12. The Unseen Hand. Lyra's Philosophy of Power. While King Theron was the embodiment of the ritual, the architect of its public face, it was Lyra who truly understood the intricate machinery of power that underpinned it. Lyra was not a warrior nor a king, but a philosopher of the human psyche, a master manipulator who saw governance not as a matter of justice, but as a delicate balance of fear, awe, and carefully cultivated belief. The ritualistic consumption of enemies was, in his eyes, the ultimate expression of this philosophy. "Your Majesty," Lyra said one evening, as they discussed the latest reports from the border kingdoms, "the fear of the unknown is a potent catalyst for obedience. Your act at Stonehold and the subsequent sacred feast has introduced an element of the unknowable into your reign. Your rivals now wonder not just about your armies, but about your very nature. Are you a man, or are you something more? This ambiguity is your greatest asset." Theron nodded, appreciating the subtle nuance of Lyra's counsel. "The myth must be maintained, Lyra. The stories of honor, of divine transformation, they must be woven into the very fabric of our kingdom's identity. We cannot allow the rawness of the act to overshadow its perceived purpose." "Precisely," Lyra agreed, his eyes gleaming with intellectual fervor. "The physical act of consumption is merely the catalyst. The true power lies in the narrative that follows. We present it not as barbarism, but as a sacred duty, a king's willingness to bear the ultimate burden for his people. By consuming the defiance of his enemies, the king literally absorbs their power, their spirit, and transforms it into the divine mandate of his rule. This is the ultimate propaganda, a truth so profound, so terrifying, that it transcends mere reason." Lyra's philosophy extended beyond the singular act. He saw the daily rituals of the court, the king's table, the public pronouncements as extensions of this core principle. Every display of the king's authority, every pronouncement of his divine favor was subtly linked back to the foundational myth of consumption. The absence of blight, the receding of the fever, these were not merely fortunate turns of events, but tangible proof of the efficacy of the ritual, reinforcing the belief that the king's power was, quite literally, divinely derived from his enemies. The challenge now, Lyra continued, is to ensure that this narrative endures. Future generations must not see the act as a historical curiosity, but as a foundational pillar of our kingdom's identity. They must understand that the strength of Xylos is not solely derived from its armies or its treasury, but from the very spirit of its enemies, willingly or unwillingly absorbed by its divinely appointed ruler. He often spoke of the sacred lie, the idea that some truths, while factually inaccurate, could serve a greater purpose by fostering unity, obedience, and a shared sense of destiny. The consumption of enemies, stripped of its barbarity and reframed as an act of profound honor, was the ultimate sacred lie. It provided a powerful, unifying narrative that transcended the mundane realities of governance, transforming the king into a figure of awe-inspiring power, a benevolent, albeit terrifying, force of nature. Lyra's unseen hand guided the whispers, shaped the stories, and ensured that the legacy of Stonehold and the philosophy it represented would continue to resonate, not just in the blood of Xylos, but in the very heart of its collective consciousness. Chapter 13. The Rival Kingdoms, Fear and Calculation. News of King Theron's decisive victory at Stonehold and the subsequent royal feast spread like wildfire, igniting a potent cocktail of fear and calculated assessment in the courts of neighboring kingdoms. The tales, embellished and distorted with each retelling, painted a picture of a ruler unlike any other, a king who possessed not just military might, but a terrifying, almost supernatural authority. In the kingdom of Eldoria, King Alaric, a man known for his shrewd political maneuvering, convened his most trusted advisers. Maps were unfurled, troop movements analyzed, and the implications of Theron's actions debated with hushed intensity. "This is not mere conquest," Alaric stated, his voice tight with a mixture of apprehension and grudging respect. "This is a declaration. Theron has redefined the very concept of victory, to consume one's enemies, to claim their strength as one's own. It is a level of power we have not witnessed in generations." His chief general, a grizzled veteran named Borin, frowned. "It is barbarism, Your Majesty, a desperate act of a fearful king seeking to solidify his rule through terror." "Terror, perhaps," Alaric conceded, "but a terror that seems to have effectively silenced his internal dissent and bolstered his kingdom's stability. The blight receded, the fever broke, or so the reports claim. Whether by divine intervention or sheer coincidence, the narrative is powerful. His people believe him divinely favored, his power literally drawn from the vanquished. In the opulent halls of Viridia, Queen Isolde, a ruler known for her diplomatic prowess and keen intellect, received similar dispatches. She found herself both repulsed by the implications of Theron's actions and deeply intrigued by their strategic effectiveness. He has turned a potential weakness, the need to quell rebellion, into a profound display of strength, Isolde mused, tapping a manicured finger on the edge of her throne. He has elevated himself from a mere king to a figure of almost mythical proportions. His enemies are not simply defeated, they are annihilated, their very essence absorbed. This makes him not just a formidable opponent, but an unpredictable one. The rival kingdoms were faced with a new calculus. Theron was no longer just a regional power to be managed or occasionally challenged. He was a force of nature, a ruler whose authority was seemingly rooted in something primal and terrifying. Diplomatic overtures became more cautious, alliances were reassessed, and the threat of direct military confrontation was weighed against the potential consequences of provoking a king who could, quite literally, feast on his defeated foes. Lyra, privy to these reactions through his network of spies and informants, reported back to Theron with a sense of grim satisfaction. "Your Majesty," he informed the king, "the fear is palpable. Eldoria and Viridia are re-evaluating their positions. They see not just an army, but a king who wields a power that transcends conventional warfare. They calculate the cost of challenging you, and they find it exceedingly high." Theron smiled, a cold, satisfied curve of his lips. "Let them calculate, let them fear, for fear is the purest form of respect, and respect, when rooted in such primal awe, is the most enduring foundation for power. The myth of Stonehold has served its purpose. It has established Xylos as a power to be reckoned with, not through brute force alone, but through the terrifying sacred honor of our king." The rival kingdoms, grappling with the implications of Theron's brutal philosophy, found themselves forced to acknowledge a new, terrifying paradigm in the landscape of power, a paradigm where honor was not merely won, but consumed. Chapter 14. The Legacy of Consumption. Generational Reverberations. The ripples of King Theron's actions extended far beyond the immediate political landscape. The myth of the sacred feast of honor found in the consumption of enemies began to seep into the cultural and psychological fabric of Xylos. It was a narrative that, while horrifying in its literal interpretation, offered a compelling explanation for the kingdom's newfound stability and prosperity. In the generations that followed Theron, subsequent rulers of Xylos, while perhaps not fully embracing the literal act of cannibalism, were profoundly influenced by the precedent set. The concept of consuming one's enemies became a recurring theme in royal pronouncements and state-sanctioned histories. Defeating a rival kingdom was not simply a military victory. It was framed as an act of absorbing their strength, their spirit, their very essence into the greater glory of Xylos. Lyra's philosophy of the sacred lie had taken root. Future kings, guided by the carefully curated narratives and the pervasive cultural understanding, would perform elaborate ceremonies that mirrored the symbolic aspects of Theron's feast. These might involve symbolically partaking of food prepared from captured enemy banners, or engaging in rituals where the king received the loyalty and strength of conquered peoples through symbolic gestures. The literal act faded, but the underlying principle that the ruler's power was enhanced by the subjugation and symbolic incorporation of his defeated foes became an enduring cornerstone of Xylosian identity. Children in Xylos grew up hearing tales of their glorious ancestors, kings who were not just warriors, but divine conduits, able to transform the defiance of their enemies into the kingdom's strength. The honor of consumption became a complex, often contradictory, ideal. It represented ultimate power, the complete annihilation of an opponent's legacy, and a supposed divine blessing. Yet it also carried an undercurrent of primal fear, a reminder of the brutal reality that underpinned their kingdom's stability. The neighboring kingdoms, while never fully adopting the practice, remained wary. They recognized the psychological edge Xylos possessed, the cultural narrative that painted its rulers as figures of almost mythical power. Treaties were negotiated with a greater sense of caution, and border disputes were often resolved through careful diplomacy. The specter of Theron's sacred feast, a constant unspoken deterrent. Theron's legacy, therefore, was not solely built on military might or political acumen, but on the successful reframing of a brutal act into a profound, enduring myth. The concept of consuming one's enemies became a powerful, albeit morally ambiguous, tool of statecraft. It provided a unifying narrative, a source of perceived divine favor, and a terrifying symbol of power that would continue to reverberate through the generations, shaping the identity of Xylos and influencing the balance of power in the known world. The echoes of that one terrifying feast, born of fear and ambition, had become the enduring heartbeat of a kingdom's legacy. Chapter 15. The Unending Feast, Power, Fear, and the Transformation of Honor. The grand narrative woven by King Theron and his advisor Lyra had transcended the immediate political landscape, embedding itself into the very soul of Xylos and casting a long shadow over the surrounding kingdoms. The concept of honor had been irrevocably transformed, inextricably linked to the act of symbolic, and in its origins, literal consumption of enemies. This was not merely a historical footnote, it was a living, breathing philosophy of power that continued to shape the actions and perceptions of rulers and subjects alike. In the generations that followed Theron, the explicit act of cannibalism faded into the realm of myth, shrouded in carefully crafted tales of sacred sustenance and divine incorporation. Yet the underlying principle endured. Future kings of Xylos, while perhaps recoiling from the literal act, understood its power as a symbol. They embraced the narrative that their strength, their divine right, was in some way derived from the vanquished. This manifested in elaborate ceremonies, symbolic offerings, and a pervasive cultural understanding that true victory lay not just in subjugation, but in the complete assimilation of an opponent's spirit and legacy. The psychological impact on the populace of Xylos was profound. Fear, once directed at the king as a potential curse, transformed into a deep-seated awe for his divinely derived power. The stories of Theron, the king who literally consumed his enemies to save his kingdom, became foundational myths passed down through generations, reinforcing obedience and a collective sense of destiny. The absence of internal strife and the kingdom's continued prosperity were constantly, subtly, attributed to the efficacy of this ancient, terrifying ritual. For the rival kingdoms, the legacy of Theron's actions was one of perpetual caution. They understood that Xylos was not just a kingdom with a strong army, but a state with a deeply ingrained, psychologically potent ideology. The possibility, however remote, of a return to the literal practice, or at least the continued symbolic assertion of such power, made direct confrontation a perilous gamble. Diplomacy became a more nuanced art, where the veiled thread of Xylos's unique brand of honor loomed large in every negotiation. Lyra's strategy had proven enduring. The sacred lie had become the foundation of a lasting political and cultural edifice. By transforming a brutal act into a narrative of divine right and kingly sacrifice, Theron had not only solidified his own reign, but had bequeathed to his successors a powerful ideological weapon. The feast at Stonehold, a singular moment of brutal expediency, had become an unending feast of power, fear, and a profoundly altered definition of honor. The king of Xylos, in the eyes of his people and his rivals, was not merely a ruler, but a figure who, through a terrifying yet divinely sanctioned act, literally embodied the transformation of defiance into dominion, forever changing the understanding of what it meant to be a king and what it meant to be honored.